has to grow. It has to evolve. One thing, you know, as you mature as an individual, you understand that we all go through changes.
As well as people making an impact through philanthropy.
You know, I'm not glad I had cancer, and I don't wish it on anyone, but I am better for it.
And innovation.
You know, I don't presume it's just going to keep going. I think we work very hard to keep it the best it can be. Rhythm is a universal language, and comedy is a universal language. And you put the two together, people have a great time.
This year, Full Frame will take you further as we go coast to coast, from our new studio in New York City's Times Square to the Hollywood Hills. Let's take it full frame.
To the world, it's a spectacular natural wonder. To Egypt, the River Nile means life itself.
These waters helped create an entire civilization. And the Nile has nurtured its people for thousands of years.
Following the Nile from the far south of Egypt out to the Mediterranean Sea.
Discover the sights, the stories, and the people of this incredible river.
Join CCTV for an unforgettable adventure.
The Nile, a journey of life, exclusive to CCTV.
Welcome back to Global Business America. I'm Michelle McCory at the NASDAQ market site in New York's Times Square.
And a short train ride away down south in Washington, D.C. I'm Philip Yin with a look at the top headlines from around the world. We begin with in the U.S. Consumer confidence there fell in April to its lowest level in 4 months. That's the third consecutive month of confidence has fallen for the economy. Analysts are blaming a slowdown in hiring for the drop. And Standard Chartered says it may be moving its headquarters out of the UK. The lender is considering the plan because of how much tax it pays to the government there. So far, it's almost $500 million this year. And Google is hoping to give Europe's news outlets a little boost. The search engine giant plans to give $150 million to the region's publishers and digital journalism startups over the next 3 years.
Ukraine is asking for more support from the European Union and the United States as separatists step up their attacks. Ukraine's president and several Eurozone officials have met for talks to discuss aid. The EU has pledged $120 million to promote entrepreneurship in Ukraine. More than $75 million will also go towards making sure the site of the Chernobyl nuclear plant meltdown is safe. More than 6,000 people have been killed since the conflict began a year ago. And a donor conference in Kiev may help raise billions of dollars for Ukraine. The US and EU have already pledged to give aid. But as Kate Parkinson reports, the country's record of corruption and financial mismanagement is making donors think twice about helping out.
Like many businesses in Ukraine, this glass manufacturing company is struggling. A sharp collapse of Ukraine's currency means the cost of importing raw materials has skyrocketed. Olga, who runs the company with her father, says they are only just managing to keep their heads above water and says she doesn't know how much longer the company will survive. Braced for the worst but still hoping for the best, Olga says she has plans for expansion, but is frustrated that they can't get the funds needed to grow.
Our bank says that we don't have money for it. Actually, no resources in the country. We need resources for development. So we work, we like to work, we want to work, but we need extra resources for development.
It's a story that is far from unique. 18 months of revolution and war has taken its toll on the country's economy, and it's ordinary Ukrainians who are feeling the pain. Experts warn that if Kiev doesn't get its hands on billions of dollars soon, the country could face an economic meltdown. The situation has alarmed the international community. But potential donors say in exchange for a financial lifeline, Kiev must first show a commitment to reform.
The government has no choice. And it's not because only of IMF. It's also a very strong pressure from the society. It's also the very strong pressure from the situation itself, because the country with around $3,000 GDP per capita in the center of Europe is a bit of an anomaly. So basically everything, and people understand this, so everything pushes the government to move forward.
International lenders say improving Ukraine's business climate is vital. People here are inclined to agree. Kate Parkinson, CCTV, Kiev.
For more on Ukraine and its economy, we're joined by Charles Ortel. He's the managing director at Newport Value Partners. Charles, always a pleasure. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Charles, today the EU said to Ukraine that they will not give peacekeeping forces, despite Ukraine's concerns that there could be a fresh buildup of Russian-supported troops. Do you think that this is a mistake from the EU's perspective?
I don't think so. I mean, I think they're facing an emboldened Russia, even though Putin has been slapped pretty hard by declining energy prices, who's right next door. He can easily move as much force as he wants against the Ukraine to counter anything that the EU might send. And the EU has not exactly been successful, nor has the US, with intervention of late anywhere.
So you don't think that this would create more of a notion of stability should there be some kind of peacekeeping force there?
I don't think so. I mean, I think if you were to reassure anybody, we should be reassuring people who have not yet been pinched by the Russians, the Poles, the Baltic states, et cetera. But I think at this stage, with it's so unsettled in the Ukraine, what's the plan for victory?
Well, the economy seems to be picking up somewhat, and the European Commission President Juncker said today that the EU was happy to continuing supporting Ukraine. He said, you keep reforming, we'll keep supporting. How have Poroshenko's reforms been playing out so far?
I think some of them have worked pretty well. I mean, there's a very interesting report about how the reform in the most visible way in which Ukrainians are touched in traffic. And when I traveled in the Ukraine, my driver was stopped many times. They've changed that to make it a much more palatable experience where there's not as much of a shakedown. They've cut the bureaucracy. They're being more efficient with the taxes. So some of the reforms are working, but they haven't, I don't think, done enough to think through what makes Ukraine's economy distinctively competent against other countries around the world.
Well, one thing that has made it distinctively incompetent has been this notion of corruption, and that has plagued Ukraine back to Soviet times. In fact, back in 2003, Ukraine was ranked number 144 out of 177 in Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index. Corruption, a big problem, like you said, with the traffic, that police were very much involved with getting handouts, if you will. So what can be done to change this? Is any reform that has been implemented so far built any traction on tackling the corruption issue?
I don't think so. I mean, I think when you're sitting it geographically the way they are, a country that is reasonably poor but is close to the heart of Europe, it's a great opportunity to smuggle things into the black market into Europe. And the land borders are pretty porous, actually, as between Ukraine and most of the bordering states. So you've got, all the recipes for corruption, a history of corruption, and, how are you going to teach people not to be corrupt?
So what about all this money that the EU and the IMF has poured into Ukraine? How has that been used so far?
Well, what the reports are, it's always difficult to tell because money is fungible, but the reports are that it was routed through a lot of these NGOs. And, as we see in other large foundations around the world, it's very difficult to see how much of the money you send to an NGO to get to its intended purpose actually reaches it.
Today, well, on Friday, rather, we heard from the head of Ukraine's National Bank, Valeria Gontareva, and she said that Ukraine's economic recession has, in fact, hit its bottom, that there will be a recovery from the second quarter of 2015. What do you make of this? Is the worst over for Ukraine?
Well, I think not. I mean, when you look at where their currency is now, yes, it's not as weak as it once was. But the last time I was in Ukraine, $1 only got you 8.2 of the local currency, which I have difficulty pronouncing.
Well, the dollar, the hryvnia, has stabilized significantly against the dollar this year.
Well, but it's still 22 to the dollar.
But what has been driving the stabilization? There's been money pouring out of the country. There's been a big flight of capital. what would possibly incentivize investors to come into Ukraine?
Well, the fact that the currency is just a fraction of what it once was, the fact that, for some people looking at the natural resources, looking at the farmland, it's knocked down. And so there are vulture buyers who like to go in and take great risks. But I wouldn't call a bottom yet at all in the Ukraine.
If Ukraine's economy fails, is this a big propaganda coup for Russia and for Putin? Is the majority of the incentive behind propping up Ukraine's economy to, well, stick it to Russia, if you will?
I think from the U.S. standpoint, we definitely, I believe the folks in Washington, D.C. definitely want to stick it to Russia. Russia's sitting there hoping that more aid comes into the Ukraine because the money will go in, and once it goes in, Russia will then change the deal on natural gas pricing, terms for that. So,
but what if Ukraine's economy succeeds in turning things around, like Poland did, for example? What kind of message does that send to Russians?
Well, Poland's a very different story, one I know a lot about because the firm I used to work for, we were involved in getting the country back up and running. It's a homogenous country. We had a lot of time in the West to pour tons of money into it, and we did something very smart, and that is we transferred wealth to all the Poles through the National Investment Fund process, which took a number of years. So they've been long in going the right way. They're naturally more allied to the West than I think Ukraine has been over many, many decades. Ukraine is still, I mean, Russia still owns territory that was Ukrainian.
And you can call it comical almost, but Ukraine is asking the EU for membership. I mean, the EU's got a lot going on. Is that just completely audacious that they're even putting that on the table?
I think it is, and I think we should listen as well to what Mr. Putin's reaction on the other side. I mean, they're rattling sabers about nuclear war over that. And when you go in the long history of Russia, it really dates back 1,000 years. Ukraine is far more integral to Russia than, certain states are the border of the United States to the United States.
Well, you've always been a proponent of Putin not giving up on Ukraine. I see you're sticking to that view, Charles. We're going to have to leave it there. Charles Ortel, Managing Director at Newport Value Partners. Well, Russian President Vladimir Putin claims that his country has taken a massive financial hit due to Western sanctions and record low oil prices. He says both factors cost the economy $160 billion. Officials estimate that the sanctions alone cost Russia 1.5% of its GDP. That is roughly $27 billion. But they say the economy may recover. Still, the high inflation and a volatile ruble may make it difficult for Russia to turn the corner. And Russia's ban on food imports is part of the country's bid to strike back against Western sanctions. And now Moscow is restricting exports of fruit and vegetables through European countries. That's after Russian claims that accuse Bulgaria of using fake documents to get around the ban. Food prices have risen sharply in Russia due to the halting of Western imports. All right, coming up on Global Business America, working for the government, well, it isn't what it used to be. At least that's the case in China, where more people are preferring to risk failure as an entrepreneur rather than sticking with a comfortable civil servant job. Those details next.